Panama City is known for its pristine beaches and laid-back attitude. Founded in 1927, a lot has stayed the same. When you think of Panama City, you picture white sandy beaches, bikinis, spring breakers, and families having fun at the beach. But Panama City has a much less talked about darker side, and that darker side has corruption, murder, and small town vigilante justice. So what happens in a small Florida town when the best friend of the sheriff is murdered? To tell that story, we'll need to start with this one. The date was January 16th, 1939. It was a typically mild winter day in this small coastal city. Here at 135 Harrison Avenue, prominent businessman and former city commissioner Roy Van Kleeck went about his day at the Van Kleeck Company, the first hardware store in Panama City, selling just about everything a person could want in 1939, anything from pistols to pots and pans. Roy Van Kleeck was well respected and highly thought of in the community. He was a tall, handsome man, a veteran of World War I, and was carrying on his family's name and business. His father had originally started the family's business in Lynn Haven after moving to the area from New York in 1917. At this time, Panama City was really up and coming. In 1926, Panama City experienced a huge building boom, and Roy wanted in on the action.
In 1939, there had been a building boom, and most of them were here. I have researched a lot of these buildings in this end of town, and these were the first buildings that were built in Panama City. This is the beginning of Panama City. Start down there at the water and it moved this way. By the late 1920s, up to 4th Street was fully developed in here. And they were building in the late 20s down there at the intersection, which they call 4 Points. City Hall and the Hill Building, the Tennessee House, a fire department, all that had been up there at that end of town. And by the way, in those days, they called 4th Street and Harrison uptown. That wasn't downtown. Downtown was here. That was uptown. They thought smaller than we do today.
On the evening of January 16th, Roy Van Kleeck closed up his store and met up for dinner with a traveling salesman from Pensacola named A.N. Smith at a local cafe on Harrison Avenue. This was a routine occurrence for a man that always had a routine.
My name is Larry Glenn Smith. My grandfather was A.N. Smith. He was one of the last ones that saw Roy Van Kleeck on that tragic night. A little bit about my grandfather. He grew up on a farm in Montgomery, Alabama. He married my grandmother, Louise Norman. She was a Southern Bell operator in Montgomery. My grandfather worked for Teague Hardware. He learned the hardware business. He was in the U.S. Army for a little bit in France. Later, when he came back, they moved to Pensacola, Florida. He became a hardware salesman himself, representing Shapley out of Chicago, Illinois. He was a business-to-business salesman, and he sold hardware to Roy Van Kleeck. He was one of his customers, and they knew each other very well. They were friends. They were both U.S. Army veterans of World War I. And to go into that night, he was here that night with Roy. They had dinner that night. They were walking back to the store on Harrison Avenue. They walked back to the store, and near the Ritz Theater, the owner of the Ritz, or manager, saw someone following behind them.
Al Barber would later tell detectives that he had talked to Roy for several minutes and that he had been walking with a man who he did not know, and that another man that appeared to be a carpenter was lurking behind them about 50 yards away. Al Barber said he talked with Roy Van Kleeck for quite some time while this other man waited in the distance. Al Barber also told detectives that Mr. Van Kleeck was in the best of mood, even boasting of collecting a $2,300 debt on Friday the 13th, an omen that would soon visit him. They finished up their conversation and Mr. Smith returned to his car for his long drive back to Pensacola. Roy Van Kleeck would return to his car that was parked at this location, now 21 Oak Avenue, which then was just a parking lot. It would be here where he would meet his fate. Al Barber and Mr. Smith would be the last people to ever see Roy Van Kleeck alive. Back home, when Roy Van Kleeck, who never strayed far from his daily routine, did not return around his usual time at 9 p.m., his wife became worried, and when Roy Van Kleeck did not arrive by 2 a.m., his wife frantically called the police to report his disappearance. She also knew that he always carried large sums of cash, and she was extremely worried. Van Kleeck's employees also told detectives that Roy regularly carried large sums of cash around, usually around $4,000, today's equivalent of carrying around $85,000.
Roy Van Kleeck was known to carry a lot of cash, particularly because he would cash checks from the paper mill for workers who needed their checks cashed. The banks were closed, and so he always had a lot of cash on hand to cash their checks.
I speculate that this is because many people after the Great Depression did not trust banks, preferred doing business with Mr. Van Kleeck, a man who they could trust. So answering that frantic call from Mrs. Van Kleeck was Roy Van Kleeck's longtime friend and sheriff, John Scott. And hearing that his best friend for over 30 years was missing, he began an immediate search. This was his friend, and this was personal. At around 8 a.m. that morning, they got their first break in the case when Deputy Coy Rushing found Roy Van Kleeck's car by Greenwood Cemetery in a pine thicket. Sheriff Scott examined the car and found bloodstains on the back seat and floorboards of the car. Blood left on the running boards and other clues indicated that Roy Van Kleeck was attacked in the back seat of the car. Detectives also found 2 wallets, one empty and one filled with about $550 in cash that was apparently overlooked by the assailant. Dead set in his determination, Sheriff Scott formed a posse to search for the body of Roy Van Kleeck. There was a huge response to his call for help. Hundreds of concerned citizens joined the search. Over 50 veterans of the Spanish Civil War, black teens from the Civilian Conservation Corps, every judge and every available firefighter and policeman he could wrangle was enlisted to search for Roy Van Kleeck. Even the Boy Scouts got involved. Working on a hunch that Roy's body would most likely be dumped, every bridge in Bay County and surrounding counties was ordered to be searched by Sheriff Scott. Following morning, his hunch paid off. The search party had been sent to the then remote Browns Beach, a popular summer swimming destination known today as Panama City Beach. When deputies Coy Rushing and F.D. Nixon arrived at the old wooden plank bridge called the Old Humpback Bridge, known today as Grand Lagoon Bridge, they found blood on the railings and the floor planks of the bridge. A few hours later, just after 12 noon, Van Kleeck's body was found on a sandbar by Panama City fireman Joe Alexander and a man named Willie Redmond about 300 yards from the bridge. For years later, this sandbar would be called Dead Man's Island by local captains, although few captains today have heard that name or know of its gruesome history. Once his body was recovered, an autopsy was performed later that day by Panama City's prominent Dr. Lisenby, who determined that Roy Van Kleeck had been shot 4 times with a .30-20 caliber gun. One bullet had passed through the chin and lodged in the shoulder after shattering the collarbone, and another passed through the right wrist and entered the body, indicating that Mr. Van Kleeck was fighting with the attacker before being shot twice more in the heart.
I heard in my youth was that Miles Brown stole the gun from the Van Kleeck store and may have very well been, or I was told was probably the reason why Miles Brown was fired, why Roy Van Kleeck fired Miles Brown. And this is the actual model of the gun that actually killed Roy Van Kleeck. It's a Colt 3220 WCF.
Sheriff Scott's worst nightmare had come true. His best friend for over 30 years had been murdered, and his body callously dumped like a piece of trash off the side of a bridge. So who killed Sheriff Scott's best friend? He would soon find out. He immediately put up a reward of $1,000 of his own money for information leading to the identification of the assailant. The dedicated and loyal best friend of Roy Van Kleeck also enlisted the help of John Harmon, a U.S. Customs Service agent who happened to be in Panama City investigating rampant counterfeiting at the time. Mr. Harmon examined the car at the scene where it was found and dusted Roy's car for fingerprints. Mr. Harmon stated that there was evidence indicating that there were possibly 2 people involved. Mr. Harmon made plaster casts of shoe prints and tire tracks that were also in the area. Sheriff Scott then called the FBI office in Atlanta and pleaded for them to send the FBI's most elite detectives, the G-Men, to search for the murderer, though the FBI didn't deem the case large enough for their attention. Unfazed by this letdown, Sheriff Scott began his own investigation immediately, and in little to no time, a prime suspect was named. Witnesses reported to police that days before the killing, Miles Wilson Brown, 25, had reportedly been extremely upset at Roy Van Kleeck for firing him that previous New Year's Eve.
One thing that I don't think ever came out in any of the records was something that I remember my father telling me. He had a grocery store at the time up at 7th and Harrison, called the Causey Grocery Store. And the accused, Mr. Brown, came into the store and had just been fired by Mr. Van Kleeck. And Mr. Brown did not have any good things to say about Van Kleeck. And then later on, after my father heard about the Van Kleeck murder, he went to the sheriff and told him about what Brown had said a few days before, and that he had found out that he'd been fired.
Miles Brown was fuming over the matter and even boasted about how easy it would be to rob Roy Van Kleeck, or so he thought.
Roy Van Kleeck was a large man, and he was known to have somewhat of a temper.
Miles Brown had also told local townsfolk that he had wanted to, quote, talk things over with Roy Van Kleeck and perhaps get money for him so he can move to Miami, where his wife was living. After the murder, Miles Brown would go to his parents' house and frantically ask his father to drive him to Mariana to catch a bus. Miles' wife was living in Miami, and he told his parents that he got a letter from her saying that she had a job down there for him and he needed to get there immediately. Believing him, his father drove him to the bus depot in Mariana, where Miles would catch a bus to Jacksonville. Back in Panama City, Sheriff Scott had detectives hot on his trail and had sent men to the bus station himself, some of them even getting on the buses heading to Jacksonville. Bus stations in Jacksonville and others were notified to be on the lookout for Miles Brown. Miles Brown was soon arrested in Jacksonville by local detectives on information furnished by Sheriff Scott and a tip from a cab driver who had been driving Miles around all through the night under the name of Mr. Clark. Earlier that day, Miles had managed to charter a plane to Miami, but it wasn't scheduled to leave till 3 p.m. the next afternoon. At some point that night, Miles bought some gasoline and put it in a small container, and then he asked the cab driver to take him somewhere where he could burn his clothes. He told the cab driver that he had been in a juke joint and tried to break up a fight between a couple of guys and got his clothes all bloody, and that he didn't know how bad of condition they were in, and that he just didn't want to get in trouble. The cabbie complied and later dropped Miles Wilson Brown off at a hotel. Soon after dropping Miles Brown off, the dispatch of the company sent out a radio call to their drivers telling them to be on the lookout for a suspect matching Miles Brown's description. The cab driver radioed in that he had just dropped off a man matching that description at a local hotel. Detectives were immediately at the hotel within 15 minutes, where they found Miles Wilson Brown. Detectives knocked on the door of room 701, and Miles answered, put up his hands, and said, "You got me." When arrested, Miles had approximately $1,323 on him, the equivalent of $31,000 in today's cash. When Miles was in Jacksonville that day, people took notice of a stranger in town with a large sum of cash. Miles caught the attention of the local owner of a lunch restaurant, who told detectives that Brown had mentioned of getting $22,000 from an inheritance left by his mother. Sheriff Scott then personally drove to Jacksonville to fetch Miles Brown and transported him back to Panama City, where he would be indicted by a grand jury and face trial for the murder of Roy Van Kleeck. When news reached the community about who the suspect was, people were furious, and Sheriff Scott reported that he was getting numerous death threats on Miles Brown's life and ordered that Miles Brown be held at an undisclosed location until his trial. The trial was an event all of its own. Hundreds of people showed up. The courtroom was standing room only. While in custody before his trial, Brown was evasive and even tried to say that he had an accomplice. Witnesses had reported seeing a man named Curtis Turner driving Roy Van Kleeck's automobile, turning on the coastal highway from Browns Beach Road. Curtis Turner was also charged with murder but denied any involvement. Turner had a record for drunkenness and had also been charged with assault previously, so he was well known to police. On January 21st of 1939, the News Herald reported that Miles Brown admitted to the guilt and that it was a one-man job. When Brown learned that an innocent man had been arrested, he asked for an attorney and confessed to doing the crime by himself. He would be represented by attorney J.M. Sapp. Curtis Turner was immediately released upon Brown's confession, although it is my speculation that Curtis Turner was somehow looped into this crime by Miles Brown. Agent Harmon said that he believed that there was evidence when Roy's car was found that indicated that there were possibly two people involved, and I tend to believe this theory. I think Miles enlisted Turner's help to help him dispose of the body and dump the car. This is why Miles would later say that he had no idea where Roy's car was dumped. This is just my theory though, and I have no real proof other than speculation. Miles Brown would then confess to the murder of Roy Van Kleeck, but he would be strangely vague on the actual details of what happened. Miles said that he had waited in the back seat of Roy Van Kleeck's car. Miles would confess that, quote, "I went to the garage and waited for Mr. Roy to talk things over with him. I felt I had been mistreated and being discharged without compensation, and felt that he should at least allow me enough money to return to Miami. When we sat in that car and talked, and the conversation became warm, Roy started over the back seat and struck me, and then everything went blank. It was as if a curtain had came down between us. The next thing I remember, I was heading over the West Bay Bridge. I turned on the dome light and looked in the back and realized something terrible had happened. I could only think of getting away. I only wanted to get to Miami, but then I didn't care where I went, as long as I got away." Miles Brown told police that he had, quote, "almost gone crazy," trying to remember the details of the slaying from the time, quote, "things went black," until he recovered from the altercation. And it wasn't until he dropped Van Kleeck's blood-stained car off at its hiding place that he discovered a bulge between his coat that was approximately $1,500 in cash. He then realized he had the money to get away with. Miles went on to say that he didn't remember anything about where he dropped the car off, but he had walked up First Street to Harrison Avenue, where he had left his car and drove home. After more questioning, Miles admitting to having a .32-20 caliber pistol. He had kept it hidden under his leg while he waited in the back seat. He said he had brought the gun because he knew Roy Van Kleeck to be hot-headed, and since he was a small guy, he thought he needed some protection. Upon his confession, Miles Brown would be charged with murder by a grand jury and put on trial on the 21st of February. And on March 31st of 1939, Miles Brown would be convicted of the murder of Roy Van Kleeck. Miles Brown was sentenced to life in prison, avoiding the death penalty at that time, which was the electric chair. This was probably due to his confession and to his father's high standing in the community as a Methodist preacher. The verdict, however, did not sit well with the community. Articles in the newspaper reflected this. The following day, April 1st, 1939, April Fool's Day. Unhappy with the jury's decision, 4 or 5 masked men took matters into their own hands. At around 3 a.m., they arrived at the Bay County Jail where Miles Brown was now being held. The men quietly entered the building where they found jailer Johnny Goodwin on the second floor asleep. The masked men bound and gagged Goodwin. They told him not to come out of the room or he would never go back in. Goodwin stated that one of them said, quote, "We waited for the law and now we are going to have justice." After securing Miles Brown, the men reportedly came back into the room they had left Goodwin in and threw him back his keys. They had got what they came for. As a waiting car idled outside, Miles Wilson Brown was put in the back seat. His kidnappers then carefully drove in the center of the road to conceal their tracks as they drove down Beach Drive.
And tied up the jailer, took the guy out, and took him out to the area around Pretty Bayou.
Here, they made Miles get out of the car and walked him into the woods. He was offered a cigarette, which Miles accepted, though he would never live long enough to fully enjoy it. As he walked into the woods, his kidnappers would shoot him in the back. Once on the ground, they would then shoot him 2 more times in the back of the head. The cigarette Miles had been smoking as he walked to his death was found still in his hand, having burned down to his fingers. His body was found by a passing motorist, a man named Percy Oliver, who was a circulation employee for the News Herald. Percy Oliver discovered Brown's body at around 5 a.m., roughly 3 hours after his kidnapping. Miles was still wearing his jail pajamas, Percy had noticed. After the lynching, Sheriff Scott said that he had not added extra protection at the jail because he had stopped getting death threats against Brown's life. Officers went on to say that since only 3 to 4 men participated in the kidnapping, that the plan was thought out well in advance and kept secret. A detective from Jacksonville named E.L. Acosta was in Panama City attending the trial as a state witness against Miles Brown, examined the crime scene, and stated the killers left no clues and that the killing had been one of the smoothest jobs he's ever seen. Miles Wilson's death certificate would just simply state gunshot wounds. By the time Brown's body was brought to the mortuary on Harrison Avenue, hundreds of people stood on the streets. Rather than bring the corpse upstairs to the funeral parlor, those in charge placed Brown on a canvas cot downstairs near a window in the furniture store. They opened up 2 doors, one on each side of the building, so the curious could pass through in a long line to view the grotesque corpse. Brown was left just as he was found in the woods, with ants still crawling on his body. Among the spectators viewing the mutilated body were school children on their way to the weekly 10-cent Saturday matinee at the Ritz Theater. On Monday, April 3rd, when the lynching attracted the attention of federal investigators, Assistant Attorney General George Cooper Gibbs indicated that his office would, quote, go further into the affairs of Bay County than the shooting of Brown. The Assistant Attorney General also stated that he had been told by one county official that there had been, quote, too much politics and not enough law enforcement in Panama City. Sheriff Scott assisted in the state's investigation, but unsurprisingly, he was of little to no help, saying that he could not find any clues on who the bandits were.
Who did it? The vigilantes were never identified, and until this day we still don't know who they were.
On April 17th of 1939, a local grand jury branded Brown's slaying a, quote, unsolved mystery and closed the case. The vigilante killing of Miles Wilson Brown was swept under the proverbial rug and lost to history, never to be solved, thus ending one of the most bizarre stories and murder investigations to ever happen in Panama City. So who do you think killed Miles Wilson Brown? And what would you do if someone killed your best friend? Less than 5 months after the lynching of Miles Brown, jailer Johnny Goodwin, who was fired after the incident, would be arrested for stabbing a man in a bar fight. Deputy F.D. Nixon, mentioned earlier, 2 years later would be under inquest for shooting an unarmed suspect in the back with a rifle during a bait cart operation. And on April 14th of 1941, the News Herald would read, Sheriff Scott and 12 others to face conspiracy charges. Sheriff Scott and 11 others were arrested and charged with defrauding the government of internal revenue. Sheriff Scott and some of his deputies were caught collecting money and selling illicit liquor on which no federal tax had been paid. Basically, they were running moonshine and selling protection throughout the county. Even Scott's attorney, J. Ed Stokes, would be arrested for obstruction of justice in the case.
I read recently the list of jurors that were in the Brown trial, and I wondered today if those people had been called, if they would have been accepted as jurors, because some of the families I recognize as quite old here in town, and you would have thought that they would have known the family of Van Kleeck, maybe well enough to be called friends. Such names as Blackwell and Redmond I saw, and others, made me think that today they probably wouldn't have been accepted as jurors.
In my personal investigation, I would discover that one of the jurors listed in the trial against Miles Wilson Brown was a man named Willie Redmond. If that name sounds familiar to you, that's the same Willie Redmond that found Roy Van Kleeck's body. After speaking to a local judge about this, he replied that today it would have been declared a mistrial and Miles Wilson Brown would most likely be freed. Oh, here it is. I have finally found this guy's grave. I cannot believe it. It has been such a search to find this guy. I can't put it into words. It's emotional almost. This guy has all been but forgotten. Miles W. Brown, 1913 to 1939.